They called it a correctional system, but there was nothing to correct, no crimes to confess, no guilt to prove, just an empire built on silence. Imagine a country so vast that it swallows 11 time zones, a place where the wind itself carries secrets. That was the Soviet Union. And hidden inside its frozen veins lay something no map dared to mark, something called the Gulag. It started quietly. One train here, another there. A few prisoners at first. Enemies of the people, they said. But the numbers grew faster than anyone could count. Soon, entire cities were feeding this machine. People disappeared overnight, a teacher, a soldier, a mother. One by one, names became numbers. The Gulag wasn't a single camp. It was thousands, a web of remote labor colonies stretching from the Arctic to the deserts of Kazakhstan. To outsiders, they were correctional labor facilities. Inside, they were worlds of hunger, frost, and broken spirits. Most people think of the Gulag as a Soviet prison, but that's like calling the ocean a puddle. The truth is darker. The Gulag wasn't a place where people were sent to pay for crimes. It was where they were sent to vanish. Every day, trains rolled north. Inside them, men and women packed tighter than corpses in a grave. The guards carried rifles, but they rarely needed to use them. No one escaped, not because of the bullets, but because there was nowhere to go. The camps were built in places where even God would freeze to death. Kolyma, Norilsk, Vorkuta. The names sound almost mythical now, but back then they meant one thing: no return. Inside those frozen walls, the rules were simple: work or die, sometimes both. Prisoners built railways through permafrost, mined gold for the state, cut trees until their hands bled and froze together. The average lifespan of a Gulag inmate in certain years? Less than one winter. But what makes the Gulag truly terrifying isn't just the cold or the hunger. It's how ordinary it all was. The guards weren't monsters. Most were young men doing what they were told. The system didn't need evil. It only needed obedience. Every morning, the siren wailed. Prisoners lined up. They were counted, recounted, and marched into the white void. In that endless snow, time itself stopped. Days blended into months. Hope became a memory. You see, the Gulag wasn't just a prison. It was a factory that produced silence. When someone disappeared into it, their family received nothing. No trial, no sentence, no body. Just a whisper. He went north. And maybe that's what the state wanted most. Not the labor, not the gold, but the fear. Because fear is stronger than bullets. At night, the camps glowed with a strange kind of light, not from fires, those were forbidden, but from the northern sky. Prisoners stared at it, wondering if anyone down south could see it too. They dreamed of letters that never came. They whispered the names of people who no longer existed. One survivor later said, "The Gulag was a country within a country, and its citizens were ghosts." By the late 1930s, millions had passed through this system. Most of them had never even been accused of real crimes. Some were arrested because their handwriting looked bourgeois, others because they once laughed at the wrong joke. One man was sent to 10 years in the camps for owning a foreign newspaper. Each arrest had a file, a name, a confession, usually signed after days without sleep. But there was something strange about those files. The signatures changed, the stories didn't. The crimes were copied, word for word, as if written by the same invisible hand. It makes you wonder, how could so many people be guilty of the same impossible things? The answer is as cold as the tundra itself. Because guilt didn't matter. What mattered was the quota. The Soviet secret police had targets to meet, numbers of enemies to deliver. If they fell short, they became the next suspects. And so the wheel kept turning, fueled by paranoia and blood. Every night, trucks drove through the sleeping streets. Doors broke down, children screamed, and by morning, families were gone, their beds still warm. No one dared ask where they went. Because in a country built on silence, even a question could be a crime. And as the trains rattled toward the north, a pattern emerged, a rhythm of arrests, confessions, and disappearances so perfect it could only have been designed. But who set those quotas? Who decided how many souls should vanish each month? The answer lies in the next part. Because behind every innocent name on those lists stood men in offices, calculating, signing, approving, turning human lives into statistics, and they had a word for it. They called it the quota of souls. They called it efficiency. But what kind of system sets a number for how many people must disappear? In 1937, Moscow whispered a new word, norma, a quota. Every region, every district, every officer received one. Find me 500 enemies of the people. Find me 1,000 spies. It didn't matter who they were, only that the number was met. At first, the secret police protested. "We don't have that many suspects," some said. Stalin's answer was short. "You will find them." And they did. Night after night, black trucks prowled through the cities like hungry wolves. A knock at 2 a.m. became the sound of doom. Neighbors stopped sleeping. Curtains stayed closed. Parents taught their children never to speak names aloud, because in the Gulag's arithmetic, silence was safer than truth. One survivor remembered hearing the driver call out as he threw a man into the truck, "One more for the quota." Each arrest was recorded carefully, handwritten in thick ink, signed by trembling clerks. The charge could be anything: sabotage, espionage, even pessimism. Yes, pessimism. If you doubted the bright future of socialism, you were a threat to it. Factories were expected to meet production goals. Police were expected to meet arrest goals. Those who didn't risked joining the very prisoners they failed to deliver. The system fed on itself, a snake devouring its own tail. The narrator's voice tightens. Imagine being a commander in a small Siberian town. You've arrested everyone suspicious, yet Moscow demands 50 more. What do? You start inventing enemies. The school teacher becomes a spy. The farmer becomes a fascist. The librarian, an informer for Japan. Every signature on those papers meant another body on the train. And then came the confessions. Sleep deprivation, beatings, interrogations lasting days. Men signed anything just to make it stop. One guard later admitted, "We didn't need proof, we only needed signatures." They called it the conveyor belt. Prisoners moved from one cell to another, questioned until their minds broke. Then, the final page was placed before them, already filled out. They only had to sign. When the quotas were met, the local officials celebrated with banquets. Toasts were made to efficiency, loyalty, and the motherland. No one mentioned the screams still echoing from the basements. And for every 1,000 taken, Moscow sent back a telegram of thanks. The narrator pauses. There's something almost mechanical about it, this harvesting of souls. But the true horror isn't the cruelty. It's the calmness, the paperwork, the stamps and signatures, evil, disguised as administration. By 1938, the system had consumed itself. Some regions arrested so many people that there was no one left to guard the prisoners. Others ran out of cells and simply built new ones in basements, schools, and barns. In one report, a regional chief wrote, "Quota fulfilled ahead of schedule." The words still sit in the archives today, written in perfect penmanship. That phrase, ahead of schedule. How do you meet a schedule when the currency is human lives? The narrator's tone darkens. In that year alone, hundreds of thousands were condemned, some shot immediately, the rest sent north, to the frozen colonies where their labor was worth more than their existence. A former interrogator later confessed that even when he realized the madness, he couldn't stop. "If I refused," he said, "someone else would take my place, and I would take the prisoners." That's how the machine worked, not through belief but through fear. The trains left daily, packed with the newly guilty. Some carried priests, others poets, many just ordinary citizens caught in the wrong statistic. Inside the trains, the air was thick with panic. Prisoners whispered prayers or memorized addresses, hoping someone, someday, would learn where they vanished. But most never made it back. Because the Gulag was not only punishment, it was logistics, and the numbers had to balance. The narrator draws a breath. One woman remembered her husband's arrest. He'd been a bookkeeper. The officer showed her a file and said, "He confessed." She asked, "To what?" The officer replied, "That's not your concern." When she tried to protest, the officer sighed. "Be careful, comrade. Quotas are still open." By the end of the purge, the prisons were overflowing. Stalin ordered the excess shipped north to construction projects of special importance. The phrase sounded grand, but it meant something else entirely: the building of the camps themselves. And so, trains of the condemned were sent to build the very cages that would hold the next wave, a self-sustaining system of misery. The narrator lowers his voice. In one rare surviving document, a guard wrote that after every transport, the silence of the station was unbearable. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed their voices. But not every train went to a known camp. Some vanished completely, routed to coordinates that didn't exist on any map. Historians still debate where they ended up. Perhaps in those early years, the camps were still being carved out of the ice, foundations of wood, barbed wire, and bone. And that's where our story goes next. Because once the quotas were met, the state faced a new problem. It had created millions of prisoners, but nowhere to put them. The solution? A journey beyond civilization, to the edge of the earth, to a place where even hope froze solid. And when the train doors finally opened, the prisoners realized something terrifying. They hadn't reached their destination, they had reached their grave. The train stopped. No announcement, no station, just the screech of metal against frost. For a moment there was silence, then came the sound of boots on snow. The doors slid open, and the world outside exploded with light, white, endless, and merciless. Siberia. The wind cut like glass. Prisoners stumbled out, blinded by the glare. Some fell immediately. Their legs had gone numb during the weeks of travel. Others stood still, unsure if this was real or another nightmare in motion. They'd been told they were going to work camps. Rehabilitation through labor, the guards said. But what they saw was not a camp. It was emptiness, no buildings, no shelter, just a horizon so vast it swallowed sound. One guard pointed to a frozen hill and barked, "Camp is there!" There was nothing there. The prisoners understood. They were the camp. They would build it themselves. The narrator pauses. It's hard to imagine what that first night felt like. Temperatures dropping to -40, no firewood, no food beyond a slice of bread. Men tore pieces of clothing to wrap their hands. Women dug into the snow, trying to escape the wind. Some didn't make it through the night. In the morning, the guards gathered the survivors. "Work will keep you warm," they said, then handed them shovels that snapped like twigs in the cold. The ground was too hard to dig. The frost was deeper than the metal could reach. So they lit fires on the ground to thaw the surface, then dug fast before it froze again. They were building barracks, but every plank, every nail had to be hauled by hand from supply drops miles away. The narrator's tone tightens. This was the edge of the earth, a place so remote that compasses spun aimlessly. The sun didn't rise, it just hovered like a dying ember on the horizon. Hunger became a constant companion. The daily ration, 300 grams of bread, less than a handful, and a thin soup of hot water and cabbage leaves. Some boiled leather straps to chew, others licked icicles for moisture. The guards watched, silent. They weren't much better off. Frostbite, exhaustion, fear. But they had authority, and that was enough. When prisoners collapsed, they were carried to a pit behind the unfinished barracks. A wooden sign was placed there with one word: unaccounted. By spring, the snow melted, and the stench of decay filled the air. The narrator whispers, the earth itself had begun to reject them. The camp grew fast, barracks, kitchens, fences. But even as they built, the prisoners realized something. The more they constructed, the more arrived. New trains brought new faces, thousands of them, and each one looked the same: hollow eyes, trembling hands, disbelief. It became clear that no one was meant to leave. One prisoner later wrote, "We weren't building homes, we were building graves with roofs." Inside the barracks, the air was thick with sickness. Typhus spread through the straw beds. There were no doctors, no medicine, only the camp commandant's rule. If you can stand, you can work. At night, the wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and the snow drifted in like a living thing. Some prisoners began to hallucinate, seeing lights in the distance, thinking it was a town. They followed them, only to vanish into the white void. The narrator's tone drops lower. One guard said later that the forest ate men alive. Wolves didn't attack the camps, they waited outside, patient, knowing what each morning would bring. By the second winter, the camp was functional, if you could call it that. It had fences, watchtowers, a kitchen, and a cemetery larger than both. They gave the camp a name, something patriotic, something forgettable. The prisoners called it the Edge. And soon, the Edge became the model for all future camps. Work quotas were set, timetables established, prisoners were divided by skill, loggers, miners, road builders, each had their target, their hours, their punishment. One historian later found that for every 10 men sent to the Edge, only 3 survived their first year. The system didn't record deaths as failures, it recorded them as completed sentences. And that's how the Gulag expanded. One camp became 10, then 100, then thousands, spreading across frozen rivers, mountain valleys, and taiga forests. The narrator exhales slowly. The prisoners began to tell a cruel joke among themselves. When we die, maybe they'll finally let us go home. But death wasn't the end, because those who died became part of the foundation, literally. Bodies buried shallow under the snow thawed in summer, and when the ground shifted, bones surfaced beneath the new roads. Guards simply ordered more gravel poured on top. One survivor described it in 3 words, road of bones. That phrase wasn't a metaphor. It was a construction plan. Every Soviet achievement, every bridge, canal, and railway had its origins in these camps, but few knew it at the time. To the outside world, the prisoners were reformed citizens. To the prisoners themselves, they were the raw material of progress. And that's where the horror deepens, because what began as punishment became production. The state realized that forced labor was cheap, endless, and silent. The Gulag was no longer a prison system, it was an industry. The narrator pauses. Think about that for a moment. An industry built not on steel or coal, but on human lives. Each pickaxe stroke, each plank nailed, each mile of rail, bought with the last breath of someone who would never see freedom again. And soon, the Soviet state demanded more. More wood, more gold, more roads. The camps became factories of labor, then factories of death, factories of bones. They called it labor for redemption, but redemption never came, only exhaustion. By the 1940s, the Gulag had evolved into something monstrous, not just prisons, but full-scale industries powered by human misery. Gold, nickel, timber, coal, roads, all of it mined and built by men and women who no longer even knew what month it was. The narrator's voice lowers. Picture the tundra again. White, endless, alive with motion, but not from wind or snow, from bodies, thousands of them, bent figures hacking through ice, dragging logs, swinging pickaxes that rang like church bells in a land without gods. Every strike of metal against frozen ground was a heartbeat of the Soviet economy. Supervisors stood above the pits with stopwatches. A prisoner's value was measured in minutes survived. Productivity charts replaced humanity. Some camps even kept daily quotas for death, an expected number of natural losses. It made accounting easier. The narrator pauses. It's almost unthinkable, but in certain reports, death wasn't recorded as tragedy. It was efficiency. Less mouths to feed, more rations for the living. There was a railway once, ordered by Stalin himself, cutting across the Siberian wilderness. The dead road, they called it. Prisoners laid tracks through permafrost so deep that engines froze solid before sunrise. They dug with bare hands when shovels broke. When men collapsed, guards shouted, "Leave him, he'll be part of the foundation." And he was. Bodies buried under the sleepers. Years later, engineers found bones, rising through the gravel like pale roots. The Gulag became the backbone of Soviet construction. Every canal, every dam, every mine, a monument to the unknown dead. The narrator's tone darkens. Even architects knew. When a new project began, the first question wasn't, where will we build, but how many prisoners can we get? The prisoners themselves joked bitterly, we are the building materials. In Kolyma, men mined gold by hand in temperatures so low the mercury in thermometers froze. They dug into frozen earth with pickaxes, then thawed the ore with bonfires that smoked endlessly across the tundra. The firelight revealed faces more skull than flesh. When the yield dropped, rations were cut. The logic was circular. If you produce less, you eat less. If you eat less, you produce less, until you die. A perfect equation for extermination through labor. One survivor wrote later, "We were paid in minutes, another breath, another heartbeat." At night, prisoners stumbled back to the barracks. No one spoke. Talking wasted energy. Their breath crystallized in the air, tiny ghosts of what once had been laughter, songs, prayers. Inside, the air stank of rot and smoke. The weak slept closest to the wall to trap warmth. The strong, if such a word still meant anything, fought rats for crumbs of bread. Sometimes the guards watched in silence. Sometimes they laughed. But mostly they just looked away. The narrator exhales slowly. You might think the guards were monsters, but many were just prisoners themselves, promoted for obedience. One day they carried logs, the next they carried rifles. The uniform didn't change who they were, only what they were allowed to do. That blurred line, victim or executioner, is what made the Gulag so efficient. Fear ran both ways. Every few weeks trucks arrived, supplies in, corpses out. The dead were stacked like firewood, frozen solid, easy to count. There was no ceremony, no graves, just shallow pits dug into the ice, marked with wooden posts that the next snowstorm erased. And yet the production reports continued. Numbers met, goals achieved. Somewhere in Moscow, bureaucrats smiled at the success of Project 501, Project 6, Project Dalstroy. The narrator's tone sharpens. To them, the Gulag was proof that ideology could conquer nature, that even the Arctic could be tamed by discipline and belief. But nature has a memory. Spring came, the snow melted, and the rivers turned red. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden, hundreds of bodies surfacing from shallow graves, their faces preserved by frost, their hands still clutching tools. Guards panicked. They ordered the corpses burned, but the fires wouldn't take. The bodies were too frozen, too wet, so they buried them again, deeper this time. It didn't matter. The earth remembered. The prisoners saw the bones rise through the ground like warnings. They started calling the camps factories of bones. And they were right, because each body buried fertilized the next season of labor. Each death became part of the machine's rhythm. The narrator's voice lowers again, almost to a whisper. One engineer wrote a letter before he froze to death. "I built a bridge," he said. "When spring came, the bridge stood firm. But beneath it, I saw a skull grinning through the mud. It looked like it was laughing." The letter ended there. No one knows what happened to him. Years later, travelers on that same road still spoke of strange noises at night, the echo of pickaxes beneath the ground. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe the land itself remembers what built it. The Soviet dream stood tall on the surface, but underneath, the foundation cracked and shifted, a mass grave disguised as progress. And yet, something even more sinister was spreading through the camps. Because when the rations shrank again, and the winter returned with vengeance, men started to change. They stopped talking about escape. They stopped talking at all. And one night, when the food ran out completely, someone went missing. The next morning, the guards found blood in the snow, and the prisoners learned that hunger could make men unrecognizable. Hunger arrives quietly. It doesn't roar like the wind or crack like ice. It whispers. At first, it's a nuisance, a gnat in the brain. Then it becomes a drum. Then it becomes the only sound you can hear. In the camps, rations were mathematics with a knife's edge. Bread was weighed, not sliced. A scale decided who would think clearly and who would dream of soup until morning. The commandant's ledger said the same thing every night. Fulfill the norm, receive the gram, fail the norm, forfeit the gram. Work was not just punishment, it was currency. Every swing of the pickaxe was a bid for another mouthful of life. The narrator's breath frosts the air. Picture the table at dusk. A guard tips a loaf onto a board, black and heavy as a brick. Someone brings the scale, a small relic of civilization, rescued from a world that believed in fairness. The guard cuts the loaf, eyes level with the blade, measuring with a butcher's concentration. Prisoners lean in, chests barely rising, listening for the moment the needle balances. That needle decides whether a man will barter, beg, or betray. Bread became language. A quarter ration said, "I saw you stumble." A half said, "You're useful." A hole said, "Tomorrow you will crawl farther than today." And the crumbs, those stray shimmering flecks, were treasure. Men traded stories for crumbs. They traded buttons for crumbs. They traded the last photograph of a wife for the heel of a loaf that tasted of sawdust and smoke. You don't eat in the cold. You negotiate with it. You bargain with the frost, offering it your fingers if it will leave your throat alone. Thin soup steamed in dented tins, a ghost of cabbage crossing the lips, gone. Before the mouth understood, it had arrived. Once, someone found a lump of fat floating in the broth. A miracle. The barracks went quiet, a church without song, as the spoon made its slow pilgrimage from hand to hand. But hunger does more than empty the belly. It redraws the map of the mind. It shrinks the world to the distance between your hand and your ration, your lips and the heat. Men who used to quote poetry now recited recipes. Women who once embroidered monograms began to memorize the shape of the scales, the sound the blade made when it reached the crust. Around the stove, they spoke of bread as if it were a person they might one day marry. Tender, generous, soft. The jokes changed, too. They used to say, "When we die, they'll let us go home." Now they said, "If you want to see tomorrow, keep your bread dry." A man slept with his ration in a sock, tied around his neck like a saint's relic. Another dug a hole beneath the bunk and hid his crust in a rag. By morning, the rag was still there. The crust was not. Sometimes the thief left a token in return, a button, a nail, a splinter shaped like a cross, not out of guilt, out of ritual. A way to say, hunger took it, not me. The narrator lowers his voice. Rumors spread in winters that never seemed to end. In the far camps, they said, there were men who no longer waited for the dead to cool. They said a gang once followed a man to the latrine, not for his tools, not for his coat, but for the meat on his bones. The guards heard the stories and laughed, claiming invention. Then one morning a patrol returned with a sack. Inside, not contraband, not gold, not ore. The thing that had replaced prayer in the mouths of the starving. After that, the rules changed. Work brigades marched in pairs at dusk. The infirmary, such as it was, began to count bodies twice, once for the ledger, once for the kitchen. A new punishment appeared on the notice board, loss of ration. It was worse than the cold cell, worse than the whip. It was a sentence written directly on the stomach. Hunger made the days bend. The camps calculated norms, meters of timber, carts of ore, cubic feet of earth. The number was always just beyond what a living person could do. That was the point. If a brigade hit 98%, the ration fell. If it hit 110%, the ration rose by an amount that could not keep up with the effort spent to earn it, a treadmill carved into the ice. The brigade leader, usually a prisoner promoted for obedience, learned to measure time and chews. "Don't swallow so fast," he told a newcomer. "Chew slow. Make the bread think you love it." On Sundays, if the word still meant anything, some men saved a pea or two from the week and baptized them in hot water, inventing a flavor called memory. But hunger also found more cunning ways to feed itself. It ate trust. A man would share half his bread and swear to the other half tomorrow. Tomorrow would arrive, but the man would not. Another would trade his jacket for a bowl, warm once, cold forever. One sold his boots for grease skimmed from the soup. He worked in rags the next day and froze his toes until they were gray and soundless as stones. When he slept, someone took the rags. And always, the scale. The needle's eye that souls tried to thread. Sometimes a guard, drunk with the dullness of his own power, pressed a thumb to the pan and smiled as the slice shrank before the prisoner's eyes. He called it a lesson. The lesson was that fairness is a summer word. The narrator pauses. The commandant announced a new directive. Those who meet the first norm will receive Category A rations. No one asked what Category B would taste like. They already knew. It tasted like absence. One evening, a woman in the sewing brigade refused to give up her bread at roll call. The guard demanded it, said she had smuggled it, that it belonged to the state. She clutched it to her chest and shook her head. The guard reached for his stick. Then something crumbled in the barracks, not the bread, the silence. A dozen hands rose between the stick and the woman. The guard hesitated. Behind him, the wind blew through the cracks, humming its single note. The woman tore the bread in half. She gave one half to the guard. She divided the other half into 12 pieces and fed the hands that had been brave enough to rise. That night, for the first time in months, the barracks smelled faintly of something other than sweat and smoke. It smelled like the idea of mercy. The prisoners slept a little heavier. They dreamed of bread that didn't need a scale. Morning erased it. Morning always did. The brigades formed, boots scraped, dogs coughed. The woman who'd defied the guard did not appear on the line. Her bed was empty, the straw still pressed with the shape of a body. Someone whispered she'd been taken to the box. Someone else said, "Not the box, the pit." The pit was a rumor until it wasn't. A cell below ground, slick with ice, where the air itself turned to teeth. A place the body learned to drink its own heat. Men came out of it quiet and thin and older by years measured in hours. Some did not come out at all. And there were other whispers now, about doctors who weren't really doctors and tests that weren't really medicine, about bowls weighed before and after a prisoner ate, about notes in neat handwriting. Subject's pulse at 20 hours thready, gaze vacant, comprehension reduced. The narrator looks toward the dark beyond the fence. Hunger had taken what it wanted. But the camp wasn't finished. It wanted to know how much a person could be reduced and still cast a shadow. They would learn in the cold rooms. They would learn in the silence below the barracks floor. They would learn the way they learned everything here, by breaking something that couldn't be repaired. And when they were done, they would call it research. They called them punishment cells. But the prisoners called them the ice coffins. No windows, no heat, just a cube of concrete slick with frost where the air itself seemed to whisper, "You shouldn't be alive here." The narrator's breath slows. Imagine a box so cold that your sweat freezes before it hits the ground. Inside, a man sits on a metal stool bolted to the floor. The stool is coated with ice. He can't stand because the ceiling is too low. He can't lie down because the floor burns with cold. The guards call this standing correction. Sometimes they left prisoners there for a night, sometimes for 3. When they opened the door, the sound was always the same, a crack like ice breaking on a river. That was the body, unbending. Those who survived came out white-haired, even if they had been young when they went in. But the pit wasn't the only punishment. There were boxes half filled with water, wet cells, they called them. The water never froze, not because of mercy, but because it was constantly stirred to stay liquid, so the cold could reach deeper. Prisoners stood in it for hours, legs turning blue, teeth chattering until they cracked. The guards didn't need to whip. The ice did it for them. And then there were the ones who didn't return to the barracks at all, the ones the guards said had been sent for observation. That word, observation, should have meant safety. But here, it meant something else. The narrator's tone hardens. Deep within certain camps, especially the larger ones like Vorkuta and Kolyma, doctors worked under special orders. They weren't ordinary physicians. They came with papers stamped NKVD confidential. Their task, to study the limits of the human body under stress, hunger, cold, and fear. They called it science. It began with simple tests. How long could a man stand in freezing water before his pulse stopped? How many calories could be cut before the mind failed? They kept notebooks, precise, clean, emotionless. Subject ceased shivering after 2 hours. Subject unresponsive after 3rd day without bread. They said it was to improve survival rates for soldiers, to study endurance, to serve the motherland. But everyone in the camps knew the truth. The only thing they were testing was how efficiently a human could be destroyed. Sometimes they came for volunteers. The word itself made men laugh. Volunteer. In the Gulag. It meant you'd die differently, that's all. They offered bread for participation, 1 full ration for 1 day of testing. Many accepted. Hunger is the most persuasive recruiter in the world. The narrator's tone lowers. There was one woman, her name lost, her number remembered, who survived 28 days in the punishment pit. 28. The guard said it was impossible. The doctor in charge said it was statistically interesting. When they opened the pit, she blinked at the light, eyes milk white, skin cracked like old parchment. They gave her a blanket and wrote, "Subject retains cognitive function. Proceed with reconditioning." She didn't walk back to the barracks. She was carried. The next morning, the blanket was folded neatly on her bunk. The bed was empty. Even now in the archives, there's no record of what they did with her afterward, only a note. Further observation unnecessary. The narrator pauses. The camp ran like a clock. At one end, men dug ore, chopped wood, built railroads. At the other, they were measured, recorded, and buried. The difference between a worker and a subject was just a signature on a piece of paper. There were rumors that the experiments extended beyond endurance. Blood transfusions, frostbite amputations, starvation diets compared by age and gender. Guards whispered about a Division 12, a place fenced off even from the rest of the camp. No one knew what went on there, but the smoke from its chimneys never stopped. In spring, the smell changed. The wind carried something new, something that wasn't wood or coal. One survivor said, "When the smoke turned sweet, we knew they were testing again." The narrator exhales. Humanity was gone, stripped to numbers and reflexes. The doctors took notes while the men took their last breaths. They wrote body temperature falling while skin turned black before their eyes. And yet, they were proud of their results. Proud enough to report them to Moscow, proud enough to request promotions. In the end, only the names of the victims were erased. Those reports still exist. You can see them today if you request permission to the right archives. Typed pages, no emotion, just data. A ledger of suffering masquerading as progress. Somewhere in those records, an anonymous hand wrote a sentence that still chills historians. Under conditions of extreme cold, the body reaches silence before death. Silence before death. That silence spread through the camps like frost through a window pane. After the experiments, the survivors were sent to the hardest labor sites, the ones no one returned from. That's where the real work happened, in the mines. Kolyma. The word alone made even guards flinch. It was said that a man could live a year in Kolyma if he was strong, 2 if he was lucky. But the truth was simpler. No one survived 3. And yet, every week, new transports arrived, trains of men and women who thought they'd seen the worst until they saw Kolyma. The narrator's voice falls to a whisper. Down there, the earth wasn't just frozen, it was cursed. Because the deeper they dug, the more bones they found. Old bones, ancient bones, mixed with new ones. And still, the shovels kept striking, metal against stone, metal against skull. The camps had turned from prisons into graveyards that produced gold. Factories of bones had become fields of ghosts, and in Kolyma, the ghosts never slept. They said Kolyma glittered with gold. But it wasn't gold that shone. It was frost, and it clung to everything, even the dead. The train crawled up the mountains like a dying animal, each carriage packed so tight no one could fall when they fainted. When the doors opened, light stabbed their eyes, and the first thing they saw wasn't the horizon, it was the color white. White sky, white ground, white breath. Then the black shapes moving through it, guards, dogs, towers. Welcome to Kolyma. The narrator's voice slows. Imagine a land so cold, the air bites the inside of your lungs, so silent that even the snow doesn't squeak. A place where summer lasts 3 weeks, and the rest of the year's a punishment. Men stepped down, coughing, blinking. Some smiled. They thought they'd seen the worst already. The laughter died the moment they saw the mines. Black mouths in the ice, exhaling steam like beasts that had been sleeping too long. That's where the gold lived, and that's where they'd die. Every day began before dawn. A siren groaned through the valley, long and slow, like something mourning itself. Prisoners formed lines. No one spoke. Words froze faster than tears. Work started at first light, though the light was gray and weak, barely alive. They swung pickaxes into the frozen ground, chipping at permafrost to reach veins of gold dust that glittered faintly under the lamplight. Each strike echoed like thunder in a hollow chest. Guards shouted quotas. 5 buckets by sundown. 5 buckets meant survival. 4 meant half rations. 3 meant none. There were no tools sharp enough, no gloves thick enough. Men worked barehanded when the shovels broke, their nails snapping like thin ice. They stuffed their fingers into their mouths just to thaw them enough to grip the handle again. By midday, the first collapsed. The guards didn't shout. They just pointed, and 2 men dragged the body away. It didn't matter whether he was breathing or not. The rule was simple. The living Carry the dying until both are gone. The narrator's tone drops to a murmur. It wasn't just the cold that killed them, it was the dust. The gold dust, fine as smoke, that filled the lungs until they turned black and hard as rock. They called it miner's frost. One man said, "You dig gold with your hands, and when you die, they dig gold from your chest." The ground itself became a graveyard. When the frost broke, bones surfaced. Old prisoners, new prisoners, it didn't matter. The guards didn't bother burying them deep anymore. They just shoveled snow over them and moved the line forward. They built roads for the trucks carrying ore, roads that thawed and collapsed every summer, then were rebuilt again every winter. It was endless, a road that led nowhere but back to the beginning, the Road of Bones. It wasn't a name made by poets, it was literal. Under every meter of that road lay the remains of men who had fallen where they worked. No crosses, no stones, just bones packed tight beneath the gravel. When the wind rose, the snow shifted and the tips of ribs glimmered through the white. The narrator inhales slowly. Guards joked about it. They said, "Even the road wants to escape." But not all the guards laughed. Some began to lose their minds. They wrote reports that no one read. The men see faces in the ice. The wind cries at night. Dogs refuse to sleep. In Kolyma, madness was as common as frostbite. Sometimes when the sun set behind the ridges, the camp fell silent, and the only sound was digging. Steady, rhythmic, endless, the kind of sound that seeps into your dreams until you can't tell if you're asleep or still at work. A survivor once said, "We stopped fearing death. We started fearing the mornings." Because morning meant the count, and the count always came up short. The guards didn't waste bullets. They had quotas for those too. Instead, they let nature do the killing. "Let the frost save ammunition," one commandant wrote. By the second winter, disease swept through the camp. Scurvy, typhus, dysentery. There were no doctors left. The researchers had gone home with their notes. The prisoners treated wounds with melted snow, chewed bark to stop the bleeding. One night, a man escaped. The guards didn't chase him. They didn't have to. They just waited. The next morning, they found his body less than 2 kilometers from the fence. He'd frozen sitting upright, eyes open, mouth full of snow. They stood him by the gate for a week as a warning. Then someone carved a joke into the ice above his head. Comrade finally cooled off. The narrator's voice tightens. Humor was the last rebellion left. If you could still laugh, you weren't dead yet. In spring, when the rivers melted, the miners drank greedily. The water was yellow from the soil, sweet from the gold dust. They didn't care. They drank until their lips split. And yet, some lived. Somehow. They learned the rhythm of survival, how to steal warmth from the fire without being seen, how to trade half a ration for a minute's rest, how to pretend to work while keeping just enough strength for tomorrow. One of them was a teacher once, another, a pianist, another, a soldier who'd fought for the very government that buried him here. They shared stories quietly, almost reverently, as if speaking them kept their names from freezing off their tongues. They promised that if even one of them survived, the world would know what happened here, that Kolyma wouldn't stay a rumor. The narrator exhales. Years later, one of them did survive. He walked out, skin gray, eyes hollow, but alive. His name was Varlam Shalamov. And when he finally found paper, he wrote down everything he'd seen. His stories bled truth the state tried to erase, but not everyone who left Kolyma was allowed to speak, because after Stalin's death, silence became law again, and those who tried to tell the truth simply disappeared a second time. The Gulag's gates might have opened, but the fear that built them was still standing. And that's where we go next, to the survivors who were silenced. When Stalin died, the train stopped. The guards waited for new orders that never came. The sirens went silent for the first time in decades, and yet, inside the camps, no one cheered. No one believed it was over, because nothing ended in the Gulag. It only changed its shape. The narrator's voice falls low. Imagine the day the gates opened, not with ceremony, not with forgiveness, but with confusion. A guard reads from a paper he barely understands. Rehabilitation, it says. Release. The prisoners stand still. They don't move. Some don't even look up. One finally asks, "Release where?" The guard shrugs. "Anywhere." They step into the snow with nothing but rags and a number stamped on a paper that no one outside will recognize. Some have forgotten their names. Others can't remember what month it is. Freedom, after so many years, feels like another punishment. The narrator pauses. Many survivors tried to go home, if home still existed. They walked across ruined towns, through cities that pretended not to know them. Their old apartments were occupied, their jobs gone, their families warned not to speak to them. Enemy of the people, the papers had said, and no paper ever took it back. One man knocked on his own door. A stranger opened it. The man said, "I used to live here." The stranger replied, "Not anymore." The streetlights looked brighter than before, but they were colder too. In the Gulag, you froze to death. In freedom, you froze from memory. The survivors tried to speak, tried to tell the world what they had seen, the hunger, the labor, the bones beneath the roads. But every time they opened their mouths, someone told them to stop. Why bring up the past? Better to heal than accuse. Those things never happened. The new government called it rehabilitation without revelation. They released the bodies but kept the truth locked away. The narrator's tone sharpens. There were exceptions, men who refused to forget. Among them was a writer named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a soldier once loyal to the Soviet cause, until one careless letter criticizing Stalin sent him straight to the camps. He survived 8 years. And when he returned, he began to write, not just about the cold or the hunger, but about the machinery that made it all possible, the invisible system that turned citizens into ghosts. His words were dangerous. His pen might as well have been a weapon. He wrote one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, a story so ordinary it felt impossible to censor, and yet so real that it cracked open a silence that had lasted 20 years. The narrator whispers. The manuscript passed through trembling hands. It was typed at night, hidden in cupboards, read by candlelight. Every copy risked a life. Every page was a rebellion, and when it finally reached print, it was as if a locked door inside the nation had creaked open. For the first time, readers saw themselves reflected not as heroes, but as survivors of their own government. But truth, once spoken, spreads like fire, and the state moved quickly to smother it. The secret police raided apartments, seized manuscripts, confiscated typewriters. Solzhenitsyn's friends were interrogated, his publishers warned. He was expelled from the writers' union, followed, watched, silenced. Yet he refused to stop. He buried one of his manuscripts, the Gulag archipelago, under a floorboard, sealed in a milk bottle. He told a friend, "If I am arrested again, you know where to find it." And he was. The narrator lowers his voice. The KGB stormed his apartment at dawn. They took the pages, the ribbons, the drafts, everything except what was hidden beneath the floor. That one bottle would outlive the Soviet Union itself. But even before the book was published abroad, the state tried to erase him. His name vanished from newspapers. His face was scrubbed from photos. It was as if he'd never existed. He became a man erased by the same silence he had tried to break. And yet, the words survived, smuggled out page by page, copied by hand, carried across borders. They were read in secret in kitchens and classrooms, whispered over samovars late at night. When the Gulag archipelago finally appeared in the West, the world gasped. The horror was no longer rumor. It was documented, named, undeniable. But back home, the silence thickened again. Millions who had suffered in the camps still had no records, no acknowledgement. Their families were told the same phrase again and again. No information available. The narrator sighs. A generation vanished not only from the land, but from history itself. They were ghosts that the world refused to remember. Even after the Soviet Union fell, many of the archives stayed sealed. The truth existed, on paper, in boxes, in dusty rooms where light barely reached, but only for those brave enough to look. Historians began to uncover fragments, transport lists, interrogation transcripts, maps of camps that officially never existed. The paper trails led nowhere and everywhere at once. But one thing became clear. The Gulag wasn't just a chapter of history. It was the backbone of a regime that survived on fear. And fear doesn't die when a dictator does. It just changes its uniform. The narrator's voice darkens again. One researcher described it perfectly. The archives are full of ghosts, and they are still waiting to be counted. And that's where the story leads next. Into those archives, into the rooms where truth was filed, stamped, and buried, because what historians found inside those cabinets would change everything we thought we knew about the Gulag. But even more chilling was what they didn't find. One set of files, missing. A camp erased not from maps but from memory. Itself. And that missing camp would become the key to the darkest secret of all. The past doesn't rot. It files itself, card by card, box by box, shelf by numbered shelf. When the doors to the archives finally opened, timidly, selectively, as if the truth itself needed a permit, historians walked in like divers entering a black lake. The air smelled of dust and glue. The light was the color of old teeth. Nothing screamed here. The shelves did not weep, but the silence had weight. The clerk at the front desk asked for names, dates, topics. Transport records, he said, and slid a form across the counter. Execution lists? Another form. Camp maps? He looked up, his blink slow and reptilian. We will see what is permissible. The narrator breathes in. Picture a reading room. Green lamps, heavy tables, pencils only. No pens, no cameras without approval. Boxes arrive like coffins. Inside, carbon copies, onion skin sheets, stamps the color of dried blood. The pages whisper as they're turned. Some are burned at the edges, as if despair came with a candle, and the numbers begin to surface. Transports, counted with bureaucratic mercy. Admissions, discharges, natural losses, a phrase so gentle it feels like a crime. Lists in narrow columns, names, years, sentences, 5, 10, 25, reasons, sabotage, defeatism, silence. Yes, silence was in there too. The absence of words was once a charge. The historians went pale. They did not find monsters in those boxes. They found clerks, signatures practiced into elegance. The state had not merely killed, it had balanced the books. Estimates emerged, cautious at first, then firmer. Millions processed through the system over many years. Over 1 million never walked out. No single page screamed that truth. It seeped from 1,000 minor memos, from orders written in the cool grammar of administration. The horror wasn't in any one document, it was in the pile. The narrator's voice lowers. A pattern appears when you stack enough paper. Train schedules align with arrest sweeps. Food shipments shrink when quotas rise. The winter spikes in death's mirror ammunition shortages, then ease when the thaw comes. Cause and effect mapped in ink. And then, something else. A reference to a site code the researchers don't recognize. An object number where a camp name should be. Object 72, allocation increased. Object 72, supplies discontinued. The ledger speaks as if to itself. No location, no commander, no capacity, just a line that refuses a map. Weeks pass, more boxes arrive. The same code appears again and again in the corners of things. A requisition for fencing, a request for lime, a note about shore ice conditions incompatible with standard burial. Shore ice. The word thuds on the table like a wet glove. The narrator leans toward the lamp's circle of light. A young archivist, new to the building, whispers that certain card catalogs were reorganized in the late years when people upstairs feared daylight. He slides an index drawer across the wood. Inside, perfect holes where cards should be. Not misfiled, removed. You can measure the absence between your fingertips. Another file mentions a coastal convoy, a route that existed and then didn't. The ship's log ends midwinter. The rubber stamp says, terminated for reasons of meteorology. The captain's signature looks like a heartbeat stopping. On a microfilm reel, the historians find a memo, one page, a single paragraph, authorizing the temporary use of remote islands for unspecified corrective deployments. The date is blurred. The recipient is blacked out. But in the margin, in pencil, someone wrote a word and circled it twice. Unreturnable. The word chases them home at night. The narrator exhales. A map is pulled from a tube, coastlines like torn paper, little black squares in the white of the Arctic. Some squares are named polar stations, weather huts, fuel caches. One is only a dot with that same code, printed so faintly it seems ashamed to exist. Object 72. Permission is requested to view the personnel records attached to it. Denied. A higher permission is requested. Delayed. A third request, this time with references, signatures, official seals. Denied again with a note. No such object is recorded. But the paper trail refuses obedience. In a stack of invoices for rope and nails, Object 72 reappears like a stain that won't wash out. Rope for what? Nails for what? Another memo orders additional dogs. Dogs for a weather station? A retired quartermaster, coaxed into conversation by T and the dignity of being asked, remembers loading crates labeled with the code. Which port, he's asked. He stares into his cup. North, he says finally, past where compasses gossip. The researchers, exhausted, begin to imagine things. A camp without a name can feel like a superstition. Then, the archivist brings a final box. Found in off-site storage, he says, and leaves. Inside, photographs. Curling at the corners, silver halide ghosts. The images are poor, overexposed, underexposed, but the shapes are clear enough. A fence line on snow that looks like salt. Men in padded jackets standing so still they could be posts. A watchtower made from driftwood. A shoreline. A shoreline with ice pressed against it like broken glass. One photo shows rows of mounds, too tidy for dunes, too crude for graves. A chalkboard leans against a crate. On it, a number. No names, just the number. Behind the chalkboard, tilted in the wind, a sign on two poles. The sign is blank. Paint has peeled off in sheets, but in the grain of the wood, under the scabs of weather, there's the faintest impression of letters that once existed. The camera did not intend to capture it. The film barely did. The historians tilt the photo left-right, hold it beneath the lamp until warm. The letters tremble, then almost resolve. Not a name, a directive. Temporary. The narrator's voice thins. Temporary. A word that does not belong with fences. They search for the photographer's log. None exists. They look for the negative numbers. Missing. The only remaining clue is a stamp on the back, a depot mark from a northern city known for three things: fish, wind, and secrets. It's enough. One winter later, a small expedition sails out from that city. One historian, one ex-naval pilot, one local who knows how the sea lies. Ice grinds like teeth around the hull. The compass loses interest. The pilot squints at the sky, listens to the old radio crackle, and points where the map is blank. The island is not on charts, but it is there. Low, white, absolute. They land in a cove that isn't a cove so much as an apology from the ice. The wind is a blade, snow moves sideways, every sound is stolen the moment it's born. They walk inland, and then they see them. Not dunes, not drifts, mounds in rows as straight as weary hands could manage. Bits of wood protrude, box corners, makeshift crosses, broken sled runners stuck upright as if to measure the sky. Scattered among them, spoons, a buckle, a pencil stub with teeth marks, a tin plate stamped with a star, a boot sole, the leather gone, only the hobnails left like a constellation. The historian kneels, brushes away hoarfrost. Something looks back, curve of bone, smooth as ivory, too pale for the living world. The wind, impious, plays through the ribs like a mouth on a bottle. At the island's highest point, the expedition finds posts driven into permafrost long ago. Between them hangs a wire, twisted now into nonsense. Beyond, a rectangle of ground where the snow packs differently, refuses to settle. Ground that remembers weight. The narrator's breath is a slow count. This place was not temporary. It was erasure, staged as transit. No barracks to collapse, no chimneys to indict. Just distance, cold, and the arithmetic of abandonment. Back in the city, a final attempt is made to register what they've found. The reply arrives fast, too fast for normal mail. Your inquiry contains inaccuracies. No installations existed in the reference coordinates. Cease contact. But the island exists. The bones exist. The photographs exist. And a last page, discovered in a misfiled ledger, exists too. A sentence truncated by a tear, the ink smeared as if the pen itself had hesitated. Object 72, operations concluded, personnel rerouted, removed, reduced. The page does not say. The narrator stands at the edge of the lamp's circle. The air in the reading room has cooled. The boxes are closed. The clerk yawns. Somewhere upstairs, a clock strikes once, as if a verdict. There's only one part left to tell. Not of numbers or memos or stamps, but of a place that was designed to leave nothing behind and failed. A camp that, on paper, never lived. The island has no name. The locals call it the place that swallows sound. Even now, planes avoid flying over it. Compasses lose faith there. The ice seems to sigh when the wind rises, like something buried trying to breathe. The narrator speaks softly, each word landing like snow. When the expedition returned from Object 72, they brought evidence. Photographs, coordinates, bone samples. They sent reports to every archive, every university, every ministry that would listen. Most of them never replied. A few sent polite letters thanking them for their interest in historical research. One simply wrote, "No such location was ever registered." But denial cannot erase geography. One of the team returned alone the next year, determined to document every inch of the island. He left a journal sealed in a waterproof case. It was found later by fishermen. The first page said, "If you're reading this, I have proven the island is real." Then came sketches. Rows of graves, symbols etched into wood, fragments of tools. The entries became less coherent, as if written by someone listening to something only he could hear. The last line before the journal ends reads, "They are still here." The narrator's voice tightens. Historians later identified a handful of artifacts from the site, buttons, bits of wire, a brass tag stamped with Cyrillic letters meaning property of the ministry. No camp number, no date, nothing else. The tag was proof of life and of bureaucracy, proof that the Gulag's logic had reached even here, beyond maps, beyond mercy. What was Object 72? A punishment station for guards who had disobeyed, a testing ground for secrecy itself? No one knows, no plan survived, no witness lived to tell, only bones, only wind, only silence. But silence can be louder than confession. The narrator lowers his tone. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, journalists tried to investigate. Their stories ran once, then vanished. The photographs were reprinted without captions. Television reports blurred the island's coordinates. Someone wanted the world to forget the place that was already designed to be forgotten. One reporter asked an old pilot who had flown supply routes in the north, "Did you ever see an island that wasn't on your chart?" The pilot smiled without humor. "All of them," he said. He died a year later. The crash report listed instrument failure. In archives across Moscow, the files for Object 72 remain empty, but the folder still exists. A thin tan cover with its number printed neatly in black ink. It sits between two others, as if waiting to be filled. If you open it, you'll find only one document, a blank sheet stamped with the words "for internal circulation." No one knows who put it there. The narrator exhales. The Gulag was built to be seen only from one side, the side of productivity, of statistics, of success. But its shadow stretches farther than even history dares to measure. Object 72 was not the largest camp, not the deadliest, perhaps not even the last. Its horror lies in what it represented, the perfection of disappearance, a place not meant to kill efficiently, but to erase completely. It succeeded too well. Decades later, the sea still shifts uneasily around that island. Storms come without warning. The shoreline keeps changing, as if trying to hide itself again. But every spring, when the ice recedes, bones wash up. Not many, just enough to remind the living. The fishermen gather them quietly. They say the bones are lighter than driftwood. Some throw them back into the sea. Others bury them on the beach. A few take them home, hoping that maybe somewhere a soul will find rest. There are stories, always stories, about campfires burning on the island's cliffs at night, though no one lives there. About voices carried on the wind, speaking in Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, languages long gone. Sailors say you can hear hammering beneath the ice when the tide goes out. faint but steady, like work continuing underground. One man swore he saw footprints on the snow one morning, leading from the sea toward the hill, but none coming back down. He doesn't sail that route anymore. The narrator pauses. These might just be stories, myths born from guilt and cold, but myths grow where truth is buried too deep to reach. The Gulag's walls are gone, the towers have rusted away, but its bones remain, hidden in forests, rivers, archives, and memories. For every camp we can name, another lies unmarked. For every victim we can count, another still waits to be found. And perhaps that is the real horror, that the system achieved what it wanted most, not death, not labor, but forgetting. A silence so perfect that even the victims could not break it. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper. If you travel far enough north, beyond where the maps end, you'll find an island that isn't on any list. Walk inland, past the driftwood crosses, and you'll hear it. Not the wind, not the sea. Something else, a rhythm, a heartbeat, a sound that shouldn't still exist, because on that island, the Gulag never truly ended. It only went quiet. And if you stand there long enough, you'll realize the silence is breathing back,